The courtroom was filled with smug smiles and quiet chuckles as the four officers sat at the defendant's table, waiting for the judge to announce the final ruling. Officer Carter leaned back in his chair, adjusting the collar of his uniform with a smirk. Beside him, Officer Reynolds exchanged a glance with Officer Park, who tapped his fingers against the wooden table in anticipation. Officer Daniels, the quietest of the group, grinned at the prosecutor, as if daring her to make a move. They had played the system like a fiddle, twisting the evidence, intimidating witnesses, and ensuring that their so-called brotherhood within the force protected them. Corruption wasn't just an unfortunate reality to them. It was a lifestyle. And as they had done countless times before, they expected to walk away untouched. The judge cleared his throat, shuffling some papers. In the matter of the misconduct charges against Officers Carter, Reynolds, Park, and Daniels, the jury has reached a verdict. The entire courtroom held its breath. The officers, however, remained confident. Not guilty. The silence broke as the officer's defense attorney exhaled in relief. Carter let out a laugh, slapping Reynolds on the back. Park grinned, shaking his head in mock disbelief. Daniel smirked, casting a triumphant look at the prosecutor, who sat motionless, her hands clasped together on the table. The victim's family, seated in the front row, gasped in shock. Murmurs of outrage rippled through the courtroom. The judge banged his gavel. Order. Order in the court. The officers rose from their seats, shaking hands with their lawyer. Carter, feeling invincible, turned to the prosecutor. Tough loss, huh? He sneered. You gave it your best shot, sweetheart. She didn't respond. Her eyes held an unsettling calmness, something almost unreadable. But before anyone could question her reaction, the judge spoke again. Before we adjourn, the judge continued, I have an announcement to make regarding the appointment of a new chief of police. This caught the officers' attention. Their previous chief had been a man they could manipulate, someone who looked the other way when money exchanged hands in dark alleyways. If someone new was coming in, it could mean trouble, or another opportunity to exploit a weak leader. As of today, the department welcomes its newly appointed chief of police, the judge continued, effective immediately. A door at the back of the courtroom creaked open. The sound of heels clicking against the floor echoed through the tense silence. The prosecutor stood, smoothing the front of her suit before turning to face the entering figure. The officers watched, their expressions shifting from amusement to curiosity. And then, shock. The woman walking down the aisle, head held high, was no stranger to them. She was someone they had overlooked, dismissed, and underestimated. Someone whose career they had tried to sabotage. Someone who had seen through every one of their lies. Meet your new boss, the judge announced. Chief Evelyn Carter. Officer Carter's smirk vanished in an instant. Reynolds paled. Park stiffened. Daniels swallowed hard, his previous arrogance fading into uncertainty. Evelyn Carter reached the front of the courtroom, her gaze sweeping over the officers with a look that sent a chill down their spines. She didn't speak right away, letting the weight of the moment settle. The air was thick with unspoken threats, realizations, and a sudden, overwhelming sense of doom. You, Carter finally muttered, barely able to form the word. Surprised. Evelyn's lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. I told you, justice always finds a way. The officers exchanged panicked glances. They had spent years bending the law to their advantage, shielding themselves behind a corrupt system. But now, the very woman they had mocked and underestimated had been given the power they had always wielded so carelessly. I'll see you all in my office first thing tomorrow morning, she said, her tone sharp as a blade. We have unfinished business. With that, she turned and walked out of the courtroom, her every step a reminder that their reign was over. The celebration had ended before it had even begun. And for the first time in their careers, they knew what real fear felt like. Evelyn Carter walked out of the courtroom with her head held high, her heels clicking against the polished marble floors. The whispers and murmurs that followed her only fueled the quiet fire in her chest. For years, she had fought battles in the shadows, gathering evidence, watching, waiting, biding her time until the moment was right. And now, the moment had come. Justice hadn't been served in that courtroom today, not yet, but the game had changed. The men who had once laughed at her, dismissed her as nothing more than a nuisance, would soon understand what it meant to fear someone who knew the system just as well as they did. Only she didn't play by their rules. Behind her, the 4 officers sat frozen in place, their once smug expressions now stiff with barely concealed panic. Officer Carter, the so-called leader of the group, clenched his fists so tightly his knuckles turned white. He had always considered himself untouchable, the kind of man who could twist the law to his advantage, who could lie and manipulate his way out of any situation. But as he watched Evelyn Carter disappear through the courtroom doors, he felt something gnaw at the edges of his confidence. Something he hadn't felt in a long time. Fear. Reynolds was the first to break the silence, his voice hoarse. She can't do this. She can't. She just did, Daniels muttered, his face pale. This isn't good. Park shook his head, exhaling sharply as he raked a hand through his hair. It's worse than not good. We've made an enemy out of the one person who can actually destroy us. Carter's jaw tightened. His mind raced, trying to calculate his next move. This was a setback, sure, but it wasn't over. It couldn't be. He had spent years securing his position, ensuring his name never got dragged through the mud, no matter how dirty his hands were. There had to be a way out of this. Evelyn Carter might be in charge now, but she was still just one woman, and he had spent his entire career making problems like her disappear. Without another word, he stood, straightened his uniform, and walked out of the courtroom, his 3 fellow officers close behind. The ride back to the precinct was silent. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating, but no one dared to speak. Each man was lost in his own thoughts, each one acutely aware that their world had just shifted in a way they hadn't anticipated. When they arrived, the precinct was unusually quiet, as if the very walls knew that something dangerous was brewing. As they stepped inside, every officer, every detective, every member of the force turned to look at them. The air was heavy with something unspoken, something cold and watchful. Some looked away immediately, as if afraid to make eye contact. Others stared, their expressions unreadable. A few exchanged knowing glances, muttering under their breaths. Then, from a far end of the room, Evelyn Carter stepped out of her newly appointed office. The officer stiffened as she approached, her expression calm, but her eyes sharp. There was no hostility in her stance, no outward indication of aggression, but there was something in her gaze that made their skin crawl. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't celebrating. She was assessing them like a predator who had already decided how to dismantle its prey, one limb at a time. "Gentlemen," she greeted, her voice smooth, controlled. "Nice to see you back. I assume you're ready to get to work." Carter forced a smirk, crossing his arms over his chest. "If you think you can just walk in here and—" "I can. And I have," she interrupted, her voice cutting through his like a blade. "Let's not waste time with empty bravado, Officer Carter. You know exactly what this means. I'm not here to play games. You've had your turn." Reynolds cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "You can't just waltz in here and act like you own the place." "But I do," Evelyn said simply, tilting her head slightly. "And you're all on very thin ice. You see, gentlemen, the law doesn't forget. It doesn't matter how many cases you've buried, how many witnesses you've intimidated, how many pieces of evidence have mysteriously gone missing. The truth always has a way of surfacing, and you've left a lot of loose ends." Daniels took a slow step back, his mouth dry. "You don't have proof." Evelyn's lips twitched into a barely-there smile. "Are you sure about that?" Silence. She let the moments stretch, let them squirm, let them feel the weight of her presence, of the inevitable downfall looming over their heads. Then she took a step closer, her voice dropping to something almost deadly. "I suggest you think very carefully about your next move. Because, unlike you, I don't operate in the shadows. I don't need backroom deals or threats to make my point. I have something far more dangerous, truth. And once I start unraveling the mess you've made, not even the strings you've pulled for years will be able to save you." Carter clenched his jaw. He wasn't going to let her win. he couldn't. "We'll see about that," he muttered, his voice low. Evelyn smiled. "Yes, we will." She turned and walked away, leaving them standing there, drowning in their own fear. That night, Carter sat in his dimly lit apartment, a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring at the city skyline through the window. His mind raced, turning over every possibility, every risk. Evelyn was dangerous. Too dangerous. She wasn't like the others. She wasn't someone they could intimidate or silence. He pulled out his phone, hesitating for only a moment before dialing a number he hadn't used in years. It rang twice before a voice answered. "Carter." "We have a problem," Carter said, his voice steady. "And I need it handled." The person on the other end chuckled darkly. "Tell me what you need." Carter took a deep breath. If Evelyn Carter thought she had won, she was about to learn just how far he was willing to go to keep his empire intact. Because in his world, there was only one rule: eliminate the threat before it eliminates you. The next morning, Evelyn sat in her office, her fingers steepled as she stared at the files stacked neatly before her. The weight of the task ahead didn't intimidate her. If anything, it fueled her resolve. The corruption in this precinct had festered for too long, allowed to thrive in the shadows, while good officers either turned a blind eye or were forced out. That era ended the moment she stepped through those doors. The question wasn't whether she would take Carter and his men down. The question was how much destruction they would leave in their wake before she did. She had no illusions about the kind of men she was dealing with. Carter wasn't just a crooked cop. He was the type who had built an entire empire within the force, pulling strings with criminals, politicians, and even higher-ups who preferred to let him handle the dirty work they didn't want to be associated with. He wasn't just going to step aside and let her dismantle everything he had built. No, he would fight. And he would fight dirty. A sharp knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She looked up to see Officer Collins, one of the few men in the precinct she actually trusted, stepping inside. His face was grim, and Evelyn immediately knew something was wrong. "You need to see this," he said, setting his phone on her desk and pressing play on a video. The grainy footage showed a street corner just a few blocks away from the precinct. The timestamp marked it as from the previous night. A man in a dark hoodie walked toward a parked car. A moment later, two figures stepped out from the shadows. The streetlight flickered just enough to catch the face of one of them. Reynolds. Evelyn's blood ran cold as she watched the rest unfold. The man in the hoodie barely had time to react before Reynolds grabbed him, slamming him against the side of the car. The second figure, Daniels, pulled a gun, shoving it into the man's ribs. There was no audio, but the body language made it clear this wasn't a routine stop. This was a message. After a few tense seconds, the man nodded rapidly, his hands shaking as he reached into his pocket and handed something over. Then, as quickly as it began, they let him go, disappearing into the night. "Who is he?" Evelyn asked, her voice controlled despite the fury rising in her chest. "John Mercado," Collins said. "Low-level informant. He's been working with internal affairs, feeding them information on Carter's guys for the past few months." He exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "They found his body in an alley this morning, shot twice in the chest." Evelyn's jaw clenched. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, forcing herself to remain calm. Carter was already making his move. He knew she would come for him, and he was cutting off her avenues before she could even use them. "They're getting desperate," Collins said, "but they're also getting bolder. If they're willing to do this, it means they don't think anyone can stop them." Evelyn opened her desk drawer, pulling out a thick folder. "Then we show them they're wrong." By the time the sun had set, the precinct was buzzing with tension. Evelyn had spent the entire day making quiet moves, setting things in motion that Carter wouldn't see coming. She had sent an anonymous tip to Internal Affairs, ensuring that Mercado's murder wouldn't just be another case swept under the rug. She had also reached out to a few trusted contacts in the media, planting the first seeds of a story that, if played right, could blow the entire operation wide open. But she knew Carter wouldn't wait. And she was right. It started with the power going out. A sudden, unexpected blackout that plunged the entire precinct into darkness. The emergency generators kicked in moments later, but something fell off. Evelyn stood, her instincts on high alert. Then, the sound of distant commotion. Raised voices. A struggle. Collins burst into her office, his gun drawn. "We have a problem." Evelyn grabbed her own weapon, nodding. "I figured." They moved quickly, stepping out into the main area of the precinct. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. Officers were murmuring in confusion, some reaching for their radios only to find them dead. Phones were useless. The entire building had been cut off. Then Carter stepped into view. He walked slowly, confidently, his hands in his pockets. Behind him, Reynolds, Daniels, and Park flanked his sides, like vultures circling a dying animal. "Looks like we're having some technical difficulties," Carter said, his voice smooth, mocking. "Shame, really. Communication is such an important thing, don't you think?" Evelyn tightened her grip on her gun. "Cut the theatrics, Carter. What's your play here?" Carter tilted his head. "Play? Oh, Evelyn, this isn't a game. This is about survival. And I think it's time you realized that you've stepped into a war you can't win." Reynolds took a step forward, his expression dark. "You've been making moves, boss. Dangerous ones." He spat the last word like it was poison. "And that's a problem." Evelyn let out a short laugh. "You're scared," she said, shaking her head. "You're trying so hard to act like you have control, but you don't. You wouldn't be here if you did." Carter's jaw twitched, but his smile remained. "You think you're so clever. You think you've got me all figured out. But here's the thing, Evelyn, I don't lose." In an instant, chaos erupted. Carter lunged, but Evelyn was faster. She dodged, swinging her elbow into his ribs before twisting his arm behind his back. Reynolds went for his gun, but Collins fired first, a warning shot that sent him diving for cover. Officers scrambled, some siding with Carter's crew, others rushing to Evelyn's aid. The precinct turned into a battleground, desks flipping, punches thrown, gunfire echoing in the enclosed space. Evelyn fought like a woman possessed. She knew this was it, the moment that would decide everything. She ducked under Daniel's swing, driving her knee into his stomach before slamming his head into the nearest desk. Park tried to tackle her, but she twisted, using his momentum against him, sending him crashing into a row of filing cabinets. Then Carter got his gun. He aimed it at her, his face twisted in fury. "This is over," he snarled. But before he could pull the trigger, a deafening shot rang out. Carter staggered, his eyes wide with shock. He looked down at the growing red stains spreading across his chest, then up at Collins, who still had his gun raised. Carter's knees buckled. He fell, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Evelyn stepped over him, her expression unreadable. "No, Carter. It's just beginning." Within minutes, reinforcements arrived. Internal Affairs, the media, officers who had been waiting for a chance to take down the corruption that had poisoned the department for years. Carter and his men were dragged away, their reign finally over. Evelyn stood in the wreckage of the precinct, blood on her knuckles, her heart still pounding. She had won, but she knew this was just the first battle. There would be others, and she would be ready.